Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. My name is Jim Ryan, and I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's special Askwith Forum on urban neighborhoods and the persistence of racial inequality. It's my honor that we're hosting three leading scholars of social policy to discuss urban policy, racial inequality, and the stubborn question of poverty. Resolving these issues is not only a moral and ethical imperative, but also critical to the health of our society in terms of social mobility and economic stability. It can be difficult to have an honest conversation about this topic. We hear again and again that we are in a post-racial society and that we can't use poverty as an excuse when it comes to academic and life outcomes. It's my hope that the discussion tonight can serve as a way to help continue to have honest conversations here at the Ed School and elsewhere about the lingering and all too real impacts of poverty and racism. To help us think through this complex social issue, tonight we'll hear from Patrick Sharkey, who's a professor of sociology at NYU and the author of Stuck in Place, Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality, which was published by the University of Chicago Press last year. Patrick will talk about some of the issues that he discusses in the book, and then we will turn to our panelists, William Julius Wilson and Richard Rothstein, for further discussion, which I will moderate. So first I'll introduce Patrick and then say a few words about both Professor Wilson and Richard. Put simply, Patrick is one of the most exciting new voices in the field of poverty and urban inequality. His book, Stuck in Place, is an exceptional contribution to the conversation around this topic, and it has gained a good deal of attention both from the academic and mainstream media. For example, just to cite one example, Patrick's work on bringing our attention to the differences between poor African Americans and poor whites caught the attention of a writer from The Atlantic who nominated Patrick for developing the Graph of the Year, which showed that African American children born from the mid-1950s to the 1970s were surrounded by poverty to a degree that was virtually non-existent for white children. His book has won 2 prizes, one from the Eastern Sociological Society and one from the American Publishers. And many cite his book, quite rightly, as a way to restart a national conversation about urban poverty. This is a bit of a homecoming for Patrick, who earned his PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard University. And in fact, Bill Wilson served as not only his teacher and mentor, but also on his dissertation committee. William Julius Wilson really needs no introduction to anyone who's at all familiar with the field. He has influenced, inspired many of us in the room tonight, myself included. He is the Lewis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor at Harvard, one of only 24 university professors, which is the highest professional distinction for a Harvard faculty member. His numerous books on race and poverty have changed the way we think about economic mobility and social policy in America. And more than a quarter century after he published The Truly Disadvantaged, it remains the cornerstone of discussions about the topic. He is a recipient of 45 honorary degrees and has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Philosophical Society, the Institute of Medicine, and the British Academy. As if this were not enough, in June 1996, he was selected by Time magazine as one of America's 25 most influential people. He is also the recipient of the National Medal of Science, which is the highest scientific honor in the United States, and was awarded the Talcott Parsons Prize in Social Sciences by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003. Patrick and Bill will be joined by Richard Rothstein. Richard is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow at the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. It was his terrific idea to convene this panel, for which I am grateful. He is a former national education columnist for the New York Times and has written extensively and compellingly about education, race, and class, including his absolutely terrific book in 2004, Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap. He's also the author of numerous books and articles on teacher evaluation, charter schools, and racial segregation, both in schools and in neighborhoods. He has also written a comprehensive review of Patrick's book, which we will get to when we get to the session where we have a conversation. For now, please join me in welcoming Patrick Sharkey. That introduction was mainly for my parents. I appreciate it, James. So I can't tell you how appreciative I am to be here and how honored I am to be on a panel alongside the three of you in the front row here. James Ryan and Richard Rothstein are national leaders in education policy and research. William Julius Wilson is I think it's really not an exaggeration to say that he is a primary reason why I became a sociologist, so this is a real thrill for me. And I also want to acknowledge my parents who live nearby and made it here, who have been educators in public schools in Massachusetts for the past 30 plus years. I think, it's a thrill for me to have them here, but it's also, I hope that their presence serves as motivation for everyone to kind of limit the criticism and focus on the positives of the book. That's their role for the day. So I have not too long a time. What I wanted to do was lay out the basic argument of the book and then pull out some key empirical findings from the book and then open it up to the broader discussion. And when I do this, I usually start with the subtitle, which is the end of progress toward racial equality. What do I mean here? If we think about racial inequality from 1950s forward, I want to be clear that there was a tremendous amount of progress that occurred in the 1960s. So this was the decade of the civil rights advances. This was a decade where affirmative action was implemented on a large scale, where the black middle class really emerged. That progress ended in the 1970s. So that's my starting point for the book, and really kind of the motivation for the book is to ask what happened, how did this progress end? So just a couple empirical displays of this. This is the median income of black and white families adjusted for family size from 1970 forward, and you can see the red line is for whites and the green line is for black Americans, and the degree of persistence is just remarkable here. In fact, the gap between the median income of black and white families has grown slightly over time, as has the gap in wealth. Now, for education, it's a little bit more nuanced. The gap between blacks and whites in terms of high school completion has narrowed a little bit, while the gap in terms of college completion has actually expanded, widened a bit over time. So in addition to just the persistence of these gaps in economic status, educational attainment, we have the second finding, which is that African Americans who were doing fairly well a generation ago, who were in the middle class a generation ago, have experienced extraordinarily high rates of downward economic mobility in this latest generation. And this has only recently surfaced as we've kind of been able to access data on families over multiple generations. So this column on the right tells us that African Americans, children who were raised in middle class families, more than half have moved into a lower fifth, a lower quintile of the income distribution relative to their parents. Okay, so just an extraordinary amount of downward economic mobility compared to the 35% of African American kids who moved upward in the distribution over time. So we have these two findings: persistent racial inequality and high rates of downward mobility. And the question that motivates the book is, how do we explain these patterns? Okay, and typically when social scientists look at group-based differences, so patterns of racial and ethnic inequality, the most common starting point is to look at factors within the home. And what I mean by that are individual characteristics, family background, measures of human capital, that kind of thing. I'm drawing on a different line of research and focusing on characteristics outside the home, so the social context, the residential and school context in which families live. And really, the overarching argument of the book is that to understand the persistence of racial inequality, we really have to consider the types of environments in which black and white Americans have lived over the past 4 decades. And when we do this, we come to a very different and much more severe
picture of racial inequality. So this figure, which is from the book, and this was actually the graph of the year that James mentioned, it's not all that impressive, but I'll take it. This just shows the average neighborhood environments of black and white children in two cohorts. First, on your left is a cohort born from 1955 to 1970. And what this shows is that just over 60% of African American kids born over this time period spent their childhoods, this is from birth to age 17, the average poverty rate in their neighborhoods was over 20%. This was true for 4% of white children in this birth cohort, excuse me. And if we fast forward 30 years and look at a birth cohort from 1985 to 2000, so this is today's young adults, virtually nothing's changed. Okay, about 2/3 of African Americans in this later birth cohort have lived in neighborhoods with at least 20% poverty compared to about 6% of white children. This is not explained by income. So a natural question is whether this just means that black and white families continue to have different income, can buy into different types of neighborhoods. This is not the explanation. This graph shows the average neighborhood environments. This is as of 2000. The average neighborhood environments of black and white families within different income categories. And I'm using a scale of neighborhood disadvantage here, which considers not just poverty, but everything that comes bundled up with neighborhood poverty: joblessness, welfare receipt, family structure, the age distribution of poor communities. All of these factors go into the scale of neighborhood disadvantage. So the figures on your left here are showing that among families making less than $30,000 per year, this is in $2,000, African-American families on average live in neighborhoods that are, the scale here is standard deviation, so that are about 1.25 standard deviations more disadvantaged than the national average. Okay, whites in the same income category live in neighborhoods that have lower levels of disadvantage than the national average. Okay, so this racial and ethnic gap in neighborhood environments is present at each income level. Okay, it is present within income levels. Now, the most kind of startling finding from this graph is to compare this column to this column. And what this tells us is that African Americans making $100,000 or more in annual income live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than whites making less than $30,000 per year in neighborhood income. This is what we're talking about when we look at the interaction between race and neighborhood inequality. It is something that is not explained by income. It is a function of the segregation of American neighborhoods, okay? Okay, so we have the main conclusion from this is that if we look at the neighborhood environments of black and white children, we essentially find that these two groups live in entirely different social worlds, and this is not a function of income, okay? Now, this finding is not particularly novel within urban sociology. More than 25 years ago, William Julius Wilson wrote The Truly Disadvantaged and really was the first scholar to observe what had happened to urban poverty in the post-civil rights era. So in the book, The Truly Disadvantaged, Professor Wilson put forth an argument about how poverty had transformed, how poverty had become increasingly concentrated, and why. And he linked this with the life chances and with the social indicators of African American populations. This was followed up by Nancy Denton and Doug Massey's book, American Apartheid, which made kind of complemented Bill's work in pointing to the persistence of racial segregation and the role that it played in allowing for the concentration of poverty over time. Okay, so my book is building on these two seminal works in urban sociology and focusing on the importance of neighborhoods. But what I'm arguing is that it's not just that poverty has become increasingly concentrated in space. It's not just that segregation has persisted over time. It's that the same families have experienced life in the most disadvantaged residential environments over long periods of time, and in fact, over generations. Let me provide some empirical support for this claim. This shows the pairs of parents and children followed over consecutive generations from the panel study of income dynamics. So this is a nationally representative sample. And I'm looking at pairs of black and white parents and children, and looking at the proportion of all pairs that have lived in the poorest quarter of American neighborhoods over consecutive generations. What I find is that about half of African American families have lived in the poorest quarter of U.S. neighborhoods over the past 2 generations. So this is the median experience for African American families. This is true for only 7% of white families. So this is what I mean when I talk about multi-generational neighborhood disadvantage. A different way to make the same point is to take all the families that are currently in poor neighborhoods and then trace back in time and see how many of these families have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods for at least 2 generations. And for African American families who are currently in poor neighborhoods, about 4 out of 5 are in families that have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods for at least 2 generations. Now, the reason this is important is because when you look at the literature that has emerged on how neighborhoods, how the residential environments surrounding us affect our life chances, virtually the entire literature focuses on where families live right now. What I'm arguing is that this misses the fact that what we see right now is a continuation of disadvantage that's been experienced over long periods of time and over multiple generations of family members. Okay, so this temporal perspective, I'm arguing, should change the way that we think about the impact of neighborhoods on the life chances of different groups within the U.S. So from a theoretical perspective, if we think about this empirical literature on neighborhood effects, on how neighborhoods affect the life chances or the developmental trajectories of kids, this is kind of a standard theoretical model where researchers will look at where a family lives right now, posit some mechanisms by which living in a disadvantaged or poor neighborhood affects a given developmental outcome of kids, and then run a set of empirical models to test this, okay? If we step back in time, if we take a multi-generational perspective, then we move from this kind of fairly straightforward model of how the neighborhood might affect the life chances of kids to a much more complex multi-generational model that considers the neighborhood environments not only of the child and the family at a given point in time, but of that family over long periods of time in a family's history, okay? And when we move to this theoretical model, you'll notice that the pathways by which the neighborhood might ultimately affect the child's development are not limited to a single generation. So pathways, a child's school is a definite pathway by which growing up in a poor neighborhood might affect that child's cognitive development. But it's also the parent's school a generation earlier. The impact of growing up in a poor neighborhood does not disappear when a person enters adulthood. It lingers on to affect multiple dimensions of individuals' lives, which then extend to the next generation. This is kind of the theoretical model that underlies the argument of the book. So let me provide some evidence for this multi-generational approach to studying neighborhood inequality. Earlier I showed you findings about economic mobility of black and white families, and particularly this extraordinarily high rate of downward mobility among African Americans in the latest generation. This is from a report that I did for the Pew Charitable Trust Economic Mobility Project, where we just looked at how much of this racial gap in economic mobility can be explained by where kids grew up, the type of neighborhood in which kids were raised. And from this estimate on the left, this is controlling for everything we can observe about the child's family. Growing up in a poor neighborhood increases the probability of downward economic mobility by 50%, by about half here, okay? In other work that is not yet published, hopefully will be published soon, I looked not just at the child's, at where a parent grew up, but also at the larger spatial environment, so all the neighborhoods that surround the parent's own neighborhood. And when you do this, you actually explain away the entire racial gap in downward mobility. So what this means is that a large reason why African Americans have had such high rates of downward mobility has nothing to do with the family, has nothing to do with family background or human capital, okay? It has to do with types of environments in which African Americans are raised relative to whites. And in the US, when African Americans have moved into the middle class, this has not translated into an advantaged residential environment in the same way that it does for other groups, particularly whites. Okay, so when Black Americans move into the middle class, this does not bring them into higher quality schools. It does not bring them into safer environments. It does not bring them into neighborhoods that have lower levels of air pollution and other factors that affect children's developmental trajectories. And this is really the explanation behind, or a large part of the explanation behind this racial gap in economic mobility. Okay, so since I'm at an education school, I thought I'd share this graph. It just looks at children's perceptions and expectations of how far they want to go in school. Okay, and these questions were asked literally to children, asking them whether they hope to graduate from a four-year college and whether they expect to graduate from a four-year college. Now, the percentages that I'm showing here are the proportion of kids who say that they don't aspire to graduate from a four-year college or don't expect to graduate from a four-year college. So this is aspirations, this is expectations. I'm showing this for four groups. On the far left, this is kids from families that have never lived in poor neighborhoods over the past 2 generations. Okay, the second group is children from families that where the parent was raised in a poor neighborhood, but the child was not. Third group, the child was raised in a poor neighborhood, but the parent was not. And then the fourth group, in both generations, the family lived in high poverty neighborhoods. And the interesting finding here is that it is not just the child's environment that matters. There's actually a stronger association between where the parent grew up and the expectations that that child has for going to a four-year college, okay? So these are just raw descriptive means. In a subsequent analysis that I did with Felix Elwert, who's a sociologist at Madison, we used methods, newly developed methods from biostatistics that allowed us to control for everything we can observe about families over consecutive generations, and then estimate the conditional effect of growing up in a high poverty neighborhood over consecutive generations. And here we're focusing on cognitive skills, so how kids perform on standard tests of cognitive skills that are often thought of as IQ tests, okay? So there's this huge amount of attention paid to gaps, racial gaps, as well as income gaps in exactly these types of assessments. So here we're looking at how exposure to poor neighborhoods over multiple generations affects kids' performance on these assessments. And this is after adjusting for everything we can observe about children and their families over consecutive generations. What we find is that it looks like the cumulative experience of being from a family that has lived in neighborhood poverty over consecutive generations is what looks most severe here. Okay, so kids on the far left are from families that have never lived in poor neighborhoods. Kids on the far right are from families that have lived in poor neighborhoods in consecutive generations. And the effect of neighborhood poverty over consecutive generations is to reduce children's performance on this assessment. And this, we find the same for the other assessments available in the survey, by about 2/3 of a standard deviation. So this is just about the equivalent of the typical gap between black and white students in how they perform on assessments of cognitive skills. This is the equivalent of missing about 3 years of schooling. Okay, this is the effect of multi-generational exposure to neighborhood poverty, and it is the cumulative effect that looks most severe. Okay, so what these figures tell us is that to understand the full impact of neighborhood disadvantage, we have to consider the disadvantages faced by children in relation to a history of disadvantage experienced by families over time. Okay, so it's really arguing for a multi-generational perspective that is essential to understanding the impact of growing up in a poor neighborhood. The second piece of that is that I'm arguing that this should not only change the way we understand neighborhood inequality, but it should also change the way we think about social policy. Okay, I'm arguing that a multi-generational perspective forces us to think about policy on a different time scale. We have to think about policies that do more than provide an influx of funds into a community to run a given program over a few years before those funds are withdrawn. We have to do more than provide vouchers that allow families to make excursions out of high poverty neighborhoods before they return after a few years. This has been kind of the pattern for urban policy for a long time now, essentially since the war on poverty. We've had a tremendous amount of very good ideas about what might affect the lives of individuals in poor neighborhoods, or families in poor neighborhoods, what might affect the pattern of disadvantage in communities. But what I'm arguing in the book is that this multi-generational perspective should really change our priorities in urban policies. And I'm arguing that we have to consider investments and interventions with the potential to alter the trajectories of families and alter the trajectory of the neighborhoods they occupy in ways that persist over long periods of time. So I'm really arguing that instead of simply focusing on good ideas, we have to focus our attention on what I refer to as durable urban policies. And when I use the term durable urban policy, I don't focus all that much attention on specific programs or policies in the book. I really lay out a set of principles. And the principles that define durable urban policy are these: a policy with the capacity to disrupt multi-generational patterns of neighborhood inequality, generate transformative changes in places and in families' lives, and withstand fluctuations in the political mood and the business cycle. Now, these seem like lofty goals, okay? The truth is, we have made this type of commitment. This type of commitment is taken for granted in most communities across the country, okay? So when we think about policy toward communities, we forget that the federal government made an active decision to subsidize the suburbs. So the federal government provided home mortgages directly in ways that allowed for mass suburbanization, but they restricted these mortgages to predominantly white communities. So virtually none of the original home mortgage loans that were provided by the federal government went to non-white communities, and this was done intentionally, okay? Now, our largest federal housing policy is the home mortgage interest deduction. This is a policy that overwhelmingly benefits the most affluent homeowners. Okay, so this is a massive investment in communities. Again, it is an investment that is targeted toward affluent communities, okay, where most of the funds go to the most affluent communities across the country. We've had a consistent investment in the highway system. This is conscious policy. This is policy that has allowed suburban communities to thrive, okay? The United States gives unparalleled autonomy to local towns to set up zoning requirements that exclude unwanted populations from living within those towns. This is conscious policy, okay? So this type of durable commitment to communities is taken for granted across the country. What I'm arguing is not that we need a unique commitment to low-income central city communities. I'm arguing that the commitment that is taken for granted in most communities in the country has to be extended to low-income central city communities. This is really the core argument for durable urban policy. It's an extension of durable urban policy to the communities that have never received this sustained commitment. Okay, and we have examples of programs that fit the criteria for durable urban policy. There are mobility programs that do more than provide short-term excursions out of high-poverty neighborhoods. The classic program in Chicago, the Gautreaux program, is one. There are programs that are going on now in Baltimore and Dallas that do more than give families a voucher and send them on their way. They have extensive housing counseling. They allow families to make moves that they can sustain over time. They place families across entire metropolitan areas. So we have examples of these programs, but this is not the default. These are very uncommon mobility programs. We have examples of interventions that at least target multiple generations, so that target not just children, but their parents and previous generation as well. New Hope was a program in Milwaukee that was targeted toward low-income individuals and families in low-income communities. It was primarily a work support program, child care support program. What they found, this was in a randomized study, they found that kids' grades started to improve among the treatment group, among individuals and families. And this was made available not only to single mothers with children, but to single men as well who had children, okay? So this is an example. The Harlem Children's Zone is another very well-known example of a program that targets multiple generations. We have examples of programs that represent investments with the potential to create permanent or transformative change in communities. Programs that require inclusionary zoning are a good example of this. The Choice Neighborhoods program, at least in theory, is a program that provides intensive investments in places. It's being implemented at an extremely small scale, so I wouldn't quite call it a durable urban policy in practice, but at least in principle, is a program that meets this criteria for durable urban policy. This is where we've struggled. We've struggled with investments, urban programs, urban policies that have the potential to withstand shifts in the economy and the political mood, okay? And here is where I'm really interested to hear what our panelists say, because they know much more about the policy process, about the political process than I do. But here is where I think we have really struggled. There have been a whole lot of urban programs that have been proposed over time, implemented over time, with great fanfare, exciting programs that have been either defunded, diluted, or abandoned a few years after they've been implemented. In the current administration, we have examples of several programs that I think fit this description, programs that are really good ideas, but that don't meet the criteria for durable urban policy. So I do want to stop there and give time for our panelists, to give their own perspective on the book, and particularly to give their own perspective on this issue of urban policy. I wanted to thank William Julius Wilson, Richard Rothstein, and James Ryan, also Jody Smith-Bennett, who set up the visit. This is really a thrill to be up here, and I think we're going to have a very high-quality discussion of the book and of these topics, so I'm excited to get that going.
Thanks, Patrick, very much. Just to let you know, we'll speak for roughly half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. I want to start with a question directed to Bill and Richard. Richard, you had written that you might think that you think that Patrick might be a little bit optimistic in terms of the ability to overcome some of these challenges. And I'm wondering what you see as the most daunting obstacles to solving, or at least reducing, the problem of concentrated poverty, and whether you or Bill see any glimmers of hope.
Well, before buying into the idea that I have criticisms of Patrick's book, I have to repeat that this is the best book I've read in 27 years since Bill Wilson's book, and if anybody here hasn't bought it yet, you should go and buy it and read it. But my small disagreement with Patrick's book, and it concerns the policy recommendations that he alluded to at the end. You know, for 50 years in this country, we've had policy advocates with two poles of types of recommendations to solve this problem. One is to improve the communities of disadvantage that Patrick is describing. The other is to move people out of those communities into advantaged communities. Everybody for 50 years has said we should do both, but everybody also emphasizes one or the other. And I think, if I may say so, I think Patrick is a little bit too optimistic about the possibility of improving neighborhoods of disadvantage of the kind he's describing, and too dismissive of the options of focusing on mobility programs which move people out of these neighborhoods and into integrated neighborhoods that are class integrated as well as racially integrated. In the book, Patrick's reason for giving this emphasis is he says that integration policies, mobility programs are too politically difficult to do. And I agree with that. They're very difficult to do, but the other alternative is also difficult. We've tried for 50 years to, from model cities on, to invest in urban neighborhoods with the idea that we were going to fix the problems of people who live in those neighborhoods with choice neighborhoods programs or model cities and all of the variants in between, and those also haven't been pursued. So it seems to me that there's no basis for saying that the durable urban policy is more politically realistic than integration. I mean, the problem we have, I think, in this country, and I'm not terribly optimistic that we can solve it certainly in the foreseeable future, is that we have forgotten about the racial aspect of these problems, and so we've ignored and stopped talking about integration as a solution to these problems. And the latest fad, led by the Supreme Court, is to say that we're a colorblind society, and liberal policymakers have kind of jumped on that bandwagon and said, well, we'll just integrate people by social class rather than by race. And as Patrick has shown, socioeconomic status is not a proxy for race. The problems that we have are racial problems. They're not problems primarily of social class. So I think we need a new focus on race. He mentioned the Gautreaux program, which was a program which gave public housing residents in Chicago vouchers, such as we still have the Housing Choice Voucher Program, commonly known as Section 8. Gautreaux program moved families from public housing into suburban neighborhoods, and as Patrick said, middle-class neighborhoods, and as Patrick said, the outcomes were demonstrable. I'll just close this comment by, this debate, as I said, has been going on for 50 years. 50 years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a less complimentary term for durable urban policy. He called it attempting to gild the ghetto. And he dismissed it for that reason, and he, a minority of a small number of other policymakers advocated integration as an alternative. And I think we need to refocus on that.
So, Richard, I'd like to just slightly disagree with your interpretation of Pat's book. It is true that he points out that, a mobility program to move people en masse out of the inner city is politically unfeasible. There would be overwhelming reaction across the urban landscape. But he also points out that place-based programs are also somewhat problematic because they could be overwhelmed. Place-based programs could be overwhelmed by broader economic, political, and demographic factors. And I agree. Policies that focus on place-based interventions are less likely to have broad impacts if they're not tied to holistic policies. And this is what you said. And that it's therefore essential, as I read your book, and I think you argue, that place-based strategies be part of a broader federal commitment to combat economic inequality, and not only in our cities, but in metropolitan regions. So when I look at the problems from this broader holistic perspective, Jim, I don't have many glimmers of hope, quite frankly. Does that mean that we should not talk about what kinds of solutions we need to come up with? And the reason I don't have much optimism right now is because of our political climate. I mean, let's face it, we're not going to get any serious public policies to address these issues in the near future. But does that mean that we don't talk about what we should do when we do develop or have the right political climate? No. We have to put these things definitely on the table. And if we're going to emphasize, for example, place-based programs, I would hope that such interventions would focus on what you talked about, James Heckman's research on the need to intervene early in the lives of children, and this will have long-term cumulative effects. And I think of the Harlem Children's Zone as one example of that, because Jeff Canada is now talking about helping children as soon as they come out of the womb, and so I think we need to look seriously at some of Heckman's research and other programs. But to come back to the point I made, I'm not terribly optimistic right now that we are going to seriously address these problems. I fight pessimism all the time. I try to be optimistic, but man, when I look at this political climate, it's very difficult indeed.
Can I respond?
Pat, do you want to respond to
Yeah,
that
sure.
cheery assessment?
I mean, it's funny. When I went with the subtitle, "The End of Progress Toward Racial Equality," I didn't think I'd be criticized for being too optimistic. But all the points are completely valid. There is one thing that does give me a glimmer of hope, and that is that I think the model of policy toward the most disadvantaged communities in the country has really been a model that is to punish. I mean, the most sustained investments in the most disadvantaged communities have been investments in policing and in incarceration. That's been true for a while now. I think that model is now being recognized as unsustainable across the political spectrum. So with the 20-year decline in violent crime, there is no longer that link between central city, low-income, predominantly minority communities and crime that existed in the 1980s and that existed in the 1990s. So if there's anything that might give a glimmer of hope that the politics surrounding urban policy could change, that's it for me, that connection between crime and central city non-white communities is no longer real in a lot of cities across the country, particularly the bigger cities. So I think there's room for a change in the discussion there.
So I want to keep pursuing this line of thought. So whether you see some glimmers of hope or whether you're pessimistic, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, this question is to all three of you, what would it take to generate the political will to do something serious in response, to adopt a durable urban policy, whether it's place-based or whether it's to increase mobility? Is it a question of making the case so that those who don't live in areas of concentrated poverty understand the cost? Is it an appeal to their sense of fairness and opportunity? Is it simply just the raw politics of who's in office at the time, or some combination of the three? Even if you don't think right now we have the political climate to do something serious about it, how do we change the political climate? What are the levers?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is stop being intimidated by John Roberts and the Supreme Court and begin talking about race again. Because until we change the nature of the conversation, I don't think we're going to have a serious, we may never get serious policy, but until we change the nature of the conversation, there's no hope of doing so. We have entirely forgotten the history of how the characteristics that Patrick described came to be. We've accepted the notion that we have now de facto segregation of these urban areas. Patrick mentioned one, perhaps the best known of the policies, the insurance by the FHA of individual mortgages only to whites. It actually was far more extensive than that, and we've entirely forgotten the history. The FHA not only refused to insure mortgages of African Americans in middle-class white communities, it actually recruited an entire cohort of mass production builders across the country to build entire suburbs, Levittown being the best known one, but hundreds of suburbs like this, with the federal government making the explicit condition that builders like Levitt not sell a single home to an African American in these suburbs. This was a federal policy. And we have completely forgotten this and adopted the Supreme Court's view that we developed this segregation in some kind of de facto way because of, Potter Stewart once said, because of unknown and unknowable causes. And I think until we refamiliarize ourselves with this history, we're not going to be in a position to make the arguments that are necessary to challenge the situation that we've got. Let me just say one other thing. I recently did an examination of high school textbooks and how they deal with 20th century racial history. And the most widely used, I looked at the 3 most widely used high school textbooks in American history. Not a single one has a single thing to say about federal policy in creating residential segregation. They not only ignore it, they misstate it. They adopt the de facto myth. The most widely used high school textbook has a single sentence in the entire 1,200 pages of the book about how African Americans, passive voice, found themselves in segregated neighborhoods in northern cities. And so here at HGSE, maybe this is one place to start, and that is to look at the way in which we teach young people this history, because perhaps if we do something to change that, the next generation will be able to engage in the kind of conversation that our generation is not able to do.
Jim, I really think that we have to give if we're going to mobilize people to address the problems we're talking about, and if we're going to fight pessimism, say, we can do something, then it's going to be important to talk about framing. How do you frame the issues in a way that will resonate with the American public? That is so important. And there is considerable research out there that says that the basic American believes in leveling the playing field. So you frame the problem in such a way that, children, you shouldn't be able to enter a hospital ward in an inner city and predict with near certainty where the child is going to end up in life.
Right.
So we have to enhance life chances, and that kind of message, I think, will resonate. We have to talk about creating programs to allow people to help themselves. That's just another way of putting it. For example, just to give an example of what I'm talking about. If you're talking about affirmative action and you highlight numerical quotas or guidelines, you run into overwhelming opposition. But if you frame it in a different way, program to help people to help themselves. For example, research shows that white Americans overwhelmingly support scholarships for black kids who do well in school. You see, framing is so important, and we have not given sufficient attention to framing the issues in a way that could possibly mobilize support. Especially those of us on the left we haven't come up, Pat, with the effective sound bites that we need to really get people behind us.
Pat, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'd just say that you can actually make a pretty strong empirical case as well that the health, particularly the health of cities, depends on reducing inequality within cities. So one kind of blunt empirical fact is that economic segregation has been rising steadily from the 1970s forward. So the degree to which the poor live apart from the rich has been growing over time, even as racial segregation has been declining very slowly, very slightly. So that now in cities across the country, we have neighborhoods of concentrated affluence and neighborhoods of concentrated poverty to a greater degree than in the past. And I think you can make a very strong case, and there's a lot of research showing that this inhibits economic mobility for the urban population as a whole. So
Yeah. Could I just, add to that? Research, if, for example, if you want to get suburbanites mobilized, because they'll say, what the hell, why should I be concerned about the inner city? It doesn't really affect me. But there's growing evidence that cities and suburbs are economically interdependent. And research indicates that a reduction of central city poverty is associated with increases in metropolitan income growth. And that central city job growth increases the value of suburban property. There was a recent report by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development pointed out that in a global economy, firms will choose among regions. And the health of a central city is a key factor in deciding which region is best. So even if the firms choose to, this report said, even if firms, this is a report by the Department of Housing and Human Development, even if firms choose to reside in the suburbs, they will tend to select suburban areas around a vibrant central city. So you could sort of make the case that reducing concentrated poverty and the problems associated with it are among the factors that contribute to a viable urban city. Is that framing or just trying to make an argument? But, I just to build on your point.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Right.
I just want to add about this optimism issue and say this. Bill and I, not Patrick, but Bill and I have been around long enough to see a number of completely unpredictable and radical changes in the way people thought about problems in this country. And Patrick's subtitle alludes to it. We did make some serious progress in the 1960s and even in the early 1970s until it stopped. And so I think I don't want to repeat myself too much, but we shouldn't be intimidated overly much by the current conversation. If we continue to argue for what the facts show are necessary, it may be in unpredictable ways that the nature of the conversation will change and will have an impact. I just read Justice Sotomayor's decision in the latest Supreme Court decision against integration, the Michigan referendum decision. And I was encouraged by the fact that she's now joined Justice Ginsburg in saying that we can't simply masquerade as though these are just not racial problems, but that we have these problems because of a history of discrimination in this country. So I think that's where I get my optimism from. Not that I can point to anything specific, but just in knowing that things change in unpredictable ways if you don't allow the conversation to ignore the points that we've been making.
So I want to turn to the issue of schools, given that we are in an ed school, and ask you, all three of you, what role you think schools ought to play in efforts to combat concentrated poverty and the persistence of inequality across generations. And do you think it ought to be a priority? And if so, are the current reform efforts, charter schools, and no excuses movement on the right path? Or is the better path more mobility and more integration in schools as well as neighborhoods? Or is it not something that actually plays that important a role in terms of neighborhood health?
Well, I don't know much. What do you call this movement?
No excuses?
Yeah, no excuse. I don't know much about the no excuses movement. You guys in education are going to have to educate me on that. But I do know something about charter schools. And the question is, if we're going to address problems of urban education, should we be really enthusiastic about charter schools? Will that really help us address the problems that Patrick is talking about? Now, there are some excellent public charter schools in New York and Boston, but the empirical evidence on charter schools is mixed. But the studies really aren't very good. However, two really rigorous studies on charter schools using random assignment design, the gold standard, looking at charter schools in New York and Boston, clearly show that the public charter schools in New York and Boston significantly outperform traditional public schools. Now, however, the concern for me is not the creation of public charter schools. The concern for me is, will the public charter schools put enough pressure on traditional public schools to address the problem of institutional entrenchment? And by that I mean resistance to school reform and reinforcing or maintaining the status quo, institutional entrenchment. And that's the question that I would raise. And I want to make it clear that it's not the creation of charter schools that's important, but I do think that charter schools may be playing a role in bringing about some changes in public schools. And I look at what happened in what's happened in the city of Boston, how the public charter schools in the city of Boston have resulted in some significant changes in the school system, school reform. Now, some people will say, well, you know, only a minority of students are really involved in public charter schools. But the problem for me is, how do we bring about change? And to what extent will the creation of charter schools ultimately have some impact? It may be minimal, it may be incremental. But do we want to sit back and wait for another 5, 6, 10 decades before we do something? I remember reading Kenneth Clark's book, Dark Ghetto, in 1965. And the problems he described in that book, the chapter on public schools, are the same problems that exist today. In fact, they've gotten worse. And I just, you know, we've poured a lot of money into the school system over the years, and we haven't had significant changes. And one reason we haven't had significant changes is because of institutional entrenchment.
Well, I'm not nearly as positive in my assessment of the charter schools as Bill is, but I don't want to let this degenerate into a charter school discussion, so let me emphasize some other points if I can. I've become convinced in the work I've done on public education that there is no way that we can substantially close the achievement gap between black and white student achievement in schools with the kind of concentrated poverty, concentrated disadvantage that Patrick is describing. There are certainly things we can do to improve those schools, and in fact, we've been doing quite a bit of them. There's very little attention been paid to the fact that the achievement of the most disadvantaged black children has actually improved phenomenally over the last generation or two. The statistic which is the easiest to remember is that on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, fourth grade black students now achieve at a level that's higher than white fourth graders did just a generation ago. So there's been phenomenal improvement, but white improvement has also improved, so the gap hasn't really changed very much. So it's not that schools are not doing better and aren't improving, but that so long as you have children with all the disadvantages that they can come to school with, concentrated in reinforcing those disadvantages in single schools, I don't think there's much hope. So I do think that integration of children of disadvantaged children into middle-class schools is the single most important thing we can do. Now, in a lot of small cities and some suburban areas, you can actually accomplish some integration with choice programs, with adjustment of boundaries, of attendance boundaries, with magnet schools, and in order to try to integrate the population so that children in poverty or near poverty are not surrounded only by other children or predominantly by other children like them. But in our largest metropolitan areas, it's not possible to do it with these unless we have residential desegregation. Children who are living in places in the inner cities of Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago, and you can go on with the list of places, they're too far distant from white middle-class suburbs to be able to integrate them with these kinds of attendance zone changes. And so residential segregation is, I think, the essential ingredient. Now, what about what we can do short of that? And in our earlier discussion, I hope I didn't say that Patrick ignored mobility, or I was only talking about the relative emphasis we should be placing both on mobility programs as opposed to place programs. But I think most of the things we can do in schools don't actually have to do with schools, or at least schools the way we traditionally think of them. For example, and this is something that I find really incomprehensible about the Obama administration's education policy. I can understand, the Bush administration could be forgiven because they believed that in terms of your no excuses philosophy, they really believed that if a child comes to school in poor health and stressed from living in a high crime neighborhood or from homes where parents have less literacy, that if you have a good teacher, that the child should achieve just like anybody else, and anything else is an excuse. They really believe that. The Obama administration, in a number of ways, demonstrates that it doesn't believe that. I mean, Arne Duncan brags about how much he accomplished in Chicago by setting up school health centers, which provide pediatric care and vision care and dental care to children, and how much of an improvement in children's achievement that makes. And yet, the administration's accountability policy holds schools accountable for the same results whether or not they have a school-based health center. The administration brags about, well, the Choice Neighborhoods program, the Promised Neighborhoods, the idea of surrounding a school with social services and high-quality after-school programs. Those do make a difference, and the Obama administration emphasizes how much of a difference the Harlem Children's Zone makes. Yet they have an accountability program policy which holds schools accountable for the same results whether or not they're in a Promised Neighborhood Zone. And you could, early childhood, I mean, as Bill mentioned, and Jim Heckman has become a crusader on this issue. The birth birth to 5, the Obama administration has an early childhood challenge grant. It talks about how important it is, and yet when it has a race to the top competition, states get no points for whether they are funding early childhood of any kind of quality. So it's a completely incoherent approach to education policy. As I said, I think the most important thing we could do so far as schools go is to integrate them. To the extent we can't do that, putting things like full-service health centers, funding early childhood to get children ready to attend school, making sure that they have surrounding social services and after-school programs, I think is the next best thing and the way to improve achievement so long as children remain in these highly disadvantaged neighborhoods.
So Richard, you really think we could have massive school integration?
Nothing is going to happen soon in a massive way, but I think that's the direction we should be moving in. For example, I'll give you an example. We have a program in this country called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, commonly known as Section 8. It subsidizes the rent of low-income families up to the 30% of their income based on market rents in their community. And in most places in the country, we have a situation where landlords are permitted to discriminate against housing choice voucher holders. Not everywhere. In some places, in some states, they have adopted a non-discrimination policy against housing choice voucher holders. That could be a national policy. That's not such a radical advance over where we are now. If we prohibited source of income discrimination against housing choice voucher holders, we could accomplish some integration. It would be a step in that direction. If we went further, since the program is not fully funded and only a small share of the families who are eligible for housing choice vouchers actually get them because the funding isn't adequate, we could give preference to families who are willing to use those housing choice vouchers in low poverty neighborhoods, as opposed to allowing those vouchers to exacerbate and perpetuate the poverty that now exists by having them used in high poverty neighborhoods.
Could I just make one point? And I think your comments are very thoughtful, thought-provoking. But I keep thinking about what some people have said to me. One of my students said, I should not say this, but I'm going to say it. And I see him sitting right there. And Andrew, I'm going to say it. Many inner city schools have become dumping grounds for some of the worst teachers. This is one of the things that was pointed out in this movie, Waiting for Superman. And how, that is a major problem. And one of the things, coming back to the city of Boston, the growth of successful charter schools triggered a historic public education reform law. And this law includes, among other things, a new pay for excellence plan that allows the public schools to grant special rewards to exceptional teachers and grants principals in these poor turnaround schools the authority to adopt schedules that best address the needs of the students and to choose the best teachers across the school district. Well, that's significant. And, so I want to just throw that out on the table as part of solutions we should be talking about.
So, Patrick, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but I also want to let the audience know, if you are interested in asking a question, we'll open it up to the audience right after this. There are 2 microphones, and I just ask you to queue up on either one. So, Patrick.
Yeah, so when I looked at the history, and again, I didn't live through much of this history, but when I looked at the history of how urban neighborhoods have done over the past 50 years or so, the pattern that I've seen is that communities fall apart when there's concentrated disadvantage and when the institutions are unstable. So what that means for school policy, I think, is we have to have stable, well-supported institutions. I don't want to wade into the debate on charter schools, but I think there are a number of reform movements that are very promising. The community schools movement, some examples of the charter schools are promising. It's hard to deny that. But more generally, I think when communities have stable, well-functioning institutions, and that's not just the schools, that's after-school programs, that's daycare programs, that's a well-functioning police force. When these institutions are stable, that's homeless assistance, community development programs, then communities don't fall apart. We have a very recent example of this with the recession and the housing crisis. Communities across the country had all of a sudden levels of joblessness that hadn't been seen in decades. Homelessness could have exploded. Crime could have exploded. None of this happened, and you wonder why. And my hypothesis is that the stimulus provided $800 billion, a significant chunk of which went to communities across the country to stabilize institutions. That's why we didn't see an explosion of homelessness. Very directly, there were billions of dollars that went to homelessness prevention. There were billions of dollars that went to abandoned homes, redeveloping abandoned homes so that neighborhoods didn't become blighted. There were hundreds of millions of dollars that went to after-school programs targeting at-risk youth. So we had this economic and housing crisis, but we had stable institutions that maintained public spaces and didn't allow this crisis that was experienced by American families to become a crisis that extended into our institutions and into public spaces. So I see it as a more general issue about stable institutions ranging from schools to every other type of institution in disadvantaged communities.
Okay, questions from the audience?
My question is, to what extent, so when you're talking about families that remain in poor neighborhoods over generations, to what extent does either neighborhood choice on one hand, especially for black families who can afford to live in higher income neighborhoods, or housing discrimination on the other hand, play a role in where families end up living across generations?
Great question. So discrimination is still present. We know that from really good experimental audit studies, but I think it plays formal discrimination, blatant racial discrimination probably plays a very limited role in perpetuating racial segregation, just if you look at the scale of it. I think informal hostility probably plays a much bigger role, but I want to touch on this question of choice and preferences, because when this issue comes up, it's overwhelmingly discussed in relation to the preferences of non-whites, particularly of black Americans. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I did a study where I followed young adults as they left home. This was across the country, looking at kids who left home and moved into integrated neighborhoods. And the reason I did the study is because what I found is that later in life, these young adults ended up in neighborhoods that were increasingly segregated over time. So it kind of presents this puzzle. Why is segregation reproducing itself among kids who are selecting out of segregated communities? And the driving force is the choices of whites to leave those communities. So when young adults moved into integrated communities, those communities began to change around them. You can refer to it as unselected change. So when we think about preferences, African Americans have consistently been the group that is most open to living in integrated neighborhoods. We should really be thinking about the preferences of whites and other groups to avoid neighborhoods with substantial black population. That's been the more persistent force in perpetuating segregation.
Hi, thank you
Daniel.
for. Hi.
He's in my class, so I want.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking today. I was wondering, there's been some interesting work on the rise of suburban poverty. More than half of poor Americans live in suburbs rather than cities. And I was wondering, and that includes 39% of poor blacks, which is lower than whites, but still significant. I was wondering what you think the rise of suburban poverty means both for the intergenerational mobility that we're talking about, as well as the potential for coalition building and policy change.
I can take it.
Well, you're the star. Why don't you, we can comment after you.
Definitely not true. So we should be careful in thinking about these statistics because suburban poverty has risen, but that's mainly because suburban population has risen. So central city poverty is still much more severe than suburban poverty, which is, is not often mentioned in some of the, there's been excellent work that's come out on suburban poverty, but that piece of it has been kind of left out. That said, you're exactly right. So over time, Bill in the truly disadvantaged pointed to the outmigration of the black middle class from central city, predominantly low income, predominantly black communities, into suburban areas and how that had really changed concentrated poverty within central cities. That process has continued basically in a linear pattern since that point. So there has been more migration, particularly middle and upper income black families out of low income central city, majority black communities and into the suburbs. But what hasn't changed is the disadvantage among those left behind, the disadvantage in those central city communities. So I think there is the potential, because poverty has moved to the suburbs in a major way, and there is substantial, Paul Jargowski, his latest work tells us that concentrated poverty has made it to the suburbs in a big way. So I think there is the potential for, central city suburban coalitions, as Bill was mentioning. This is in the interest of everyone to make sure that inequality within metro areas does not become too severe, that concentrated poverty does not become too severe. But the major challenges that face us are still in central cities.
Yes, I just would like to add quickly, make a distinction between suburbs and inner-ring suburbs and the concentrated poverty that a lot of people are now talking about is featured in these inner-ring suburbs.
And I'll just add one quick thought as well. We're in a period of transition in many of these places, and so I think it's premature to draw too many conclusions about what the metropolitan landscape is going to look like. We have gentrifying cities which look to be integrated. They may soon be all affluent as the low-income black populations are pushed out into inner-ring suburbs, which also now look integrated, but which are becoming increasingly low-income. So we're in a period of transition with these phenomena, and I think it's too early to say where they're going to settle out.
Thank you, panelists. And you touched a little bit on my question, which was, what do you predict the future sociological trends will, or how our future cities and this country is going to look like, given recent trends of gentrification, reverse white flight, and the fact that the white majority is shrinking in schools and across the country? How do you see the future demographic and sociological trends of the country?
One of the key factors here is the decreased percentage of white people in a lot of central cities. And you have to ask what implications this will have long-term for the economic development of cities, because the reduction of the white population has also been associated in some cities, not others, not many others, with a decline in the tax base, because you've had increasing percentage of immigrants, for example, Latino immigrants, and a disproportionate number of blacks still residing in some of these central cities, which has affected the tax base and created problems in terms of city services and so on, including schools. But I want to emphasize that there are some cities that are really growing. I'm really sort of focusing on cities, for example, in the Midwest and some cities on the East Coast.
Well, thank you very much. Your comments are really provocative. I wondered if you could comment on what an equitable jobs policy might look like. So I grew up in Detroit during a time when we had a pretty stable middle class that worked in the manufacturing sector, mostly the automobile industry, and still there were lots of biases within the unions and participation, and today even in apprenticeship programs, which might provide training for some young people living in cities, are not available to them. So I guess I'm thinking, you know, what would an equitable jobs policy look like?
Well, the single best jobs policy is always a full employment policy. I don't mean to minimize the importance of job training programs. We should certainly have them. But if there's a demand for labor, employers will train their own labor. And the problem that we have now, the main problem we have now, is we're tolerating an unemployment rate in excess of 6%. If we reduce that through macroeconomic policy, wages will rise for the first time in a long time in real terms, and employers will train the workers that they need to fill the jobs that are available. Right now we have no skills shortages in the economy, despite the rhetoric of people who want to base policy on it, and we have stagnant wages even for skilled workers. So in the absence of a full employment policy, you can train people, but there aren't the jobs that they can fill with the training that they have.
You might say tight labor markets.
Well,
that resonates more with people in this political day and age.
Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I wanted to revisit a question I think Dean Ryan posed earlier about integrated schools. So there's quite a few districts in the United States that are trying to create school integration programs without actually integrating neighborhoods. And here in the Boston area, we have Metco, a longstanding program that sort of buses students from Boston into schools like Wellesley and Brookline. And I'm curious if you've looked at those type of programs and if you believe the effects of attending an integrated school could never outweigh the effect of continuing to live in a high poverty segregated community.
Interesting. I defer on that. I mean, David Deming, who's here, has done great work on school integration. Richard has as well, so I'm going to defer to people who know what they're talking about here.
Well, I'm having been told that I know about it, I should shut up because but I will pretend that I know something about it. Susan Eaton wrote a wonderful book about the Metco program, and it's a very nuanced book. Certainly children who were bused into those middle-class suburbs paid a price for it, but on balance, it was a positive program. Amy Stewart Wells at Teachers College has written a similar work about children in St. Louis who were bused to middle-class white schools. And I forgot the title of the book. Anyhow, Amy Stewart Wells. Again, it's nuanced. The children paid a price from being in an uncomfortable situation, but on balance, it was beneficial to them. And then for econometrics, Rucker Johnson has done some tremendous work on the effects of integration programs in the 1970s as a result of court orders to integrate schools, mostly through busing. And the results are pretty spectacular in terms of the long-term outcomes that children experienced who participated in those busing programs in terms of better employment outcomes, less teen pregnancy, less criminal behavior, and so forth. So I think the evidence is pretty good that on balance, these are very, very important programs. And as I said before, their impact outweighs much of what we can do without integration.
Okay, final question.
I'm going to make just a quick comment and then ask my question if I could. And I'm the former superintendent in Boston, and I would say that overall the Boston charter schools are very good, and I think we've tried to certainly partner with them. I think that where the charter schools have excelled in many cases is really the flexibility of hiring and certainly recruiting top staff, and secondly, I think, and very importantly, just time, being able to extend the significant amount of time that's necessary to support students who come from homes where there are high poverty rates. I will go further, though, to say that charter schools educate less than 2% of the students who are English language learners statewide, and the highest suspension rates in the Commonwealth are at one of the best performing charter schools in Boston. And so if you only look at the performance data and you don't look at these other factors, it may be easier to talk about what success really looks like. Having said that, I think there are a lot of lessons that we have learned, and the 2010 legislation that you referred to had enormous impact on our ability to have flexibilities to intervene in our lowest performing schools.
I'm sorry, does that also include extended school day and longer and shorter summer vacation?
Yes, extended school day, extended school year.
Yeah, okay,
And I
school
think,
year.
yes,
School
and I
year.
think
Yeah.
that our efforts, I mean, we've sort of, adopted some of those practices, I think, as well. And then just finally, I'm glad to hear you reference Rucker Johnson's work, since he's my son, and I appreciate that.
Carol, I didn't know that.
And I will let him know that you did. But I guess my question is, I believe that to educate the poorest children in the communities that we're serving, whether they're in charter schools or public schools, requires a greater investment than we're making financially. And I know people say, well, money doesn't matter, but if you're going to educate 4-year-olds, as de Blasio is trying to do in New York, if you're going to give kids more extended learning time, I don't see how we expect to get different results for the poorest kids in these neighborhoods. And I'm just curious, there's no real discussion about the financial investments, even though I say to my charter school colleagues all the time, tell the truth about what it really costs to get the results that you get.
So you want to end on that pessimistic note, huh? Okay, well,
I think we've made progress.
okay, good.
So I will say that I don't say this to be provocative. I think it's accurate that the most consistent and sustained investments that have been made in the most disadvantaged communities have gone to criminal justice and policing and incarceration. And I think there is a consensus that model doesn't work. So I think when we're talking about funding, we really don't have to talk about massive new investments. It would be nice, but that's not required. What's really required is a shift of priorities, a shift of the funding that exists in the most disadvantaged communities to schools and institutions, away from criminal justice and the correction system. So I think the funds are out there. We have invested. I think we've made the wrong kinds of investments.
Well, Patrick, thanks so much for writing such a great book and for coming here to talk about it. And Bill and Richard, thank you very much for joining in what I thought was just a terrific conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming.
I just thought it was terrific.